Hi everybody, it's great to be back here again tomorrow. It's Friday, Parashat Vayeshev. It's also Shabbat Chanukah. We have so many things that are taking place. Of course, the portion of the week all about Joseph and being sold. A terrible tragedy, of course, being sold by his brothers. But we see that Hashem had a whole plan, a divine plan here. And living in this area where it all takes place is always brings it much closer to home, connecting to this very geographical area that this all happened. This week's portion, I'd like to somehow connect with Chanukah and maybe just mention, I want to try to focus on one particular idea, which is, I would call it a little bit imaginative, but it's something that the Torah has many different levels. We spoke about this many times, 70 facets. If you pay attention, you see there's something very, very deep here. And it's something that's on my heart. I want to try to find more connections to this, but there's a deep concept here, and hopefully together we'll work this out. I'd like to open up in a verse in Deuteronomy 24, verse 19. It says, Ki tektzor ktzilcha basadech. The person goes out and he's cutting wheat. We all know the laws that apply to the land of Israel. V'shachachta omer basadeh. What happens if a person forgets in the field, he forgets one of his bundles, one of his sheaves of wheat in the field? It's called an omer. They would tie it up into different wheat store, stacks of wheat, and they would collect them afterwards. If they forget one of them in the field, it says lo tashuv lekachto. You shall no longer come and get that forgotten sheaf in the field. Lager layatom lalmayeh. That will be given over to the ger, the sojourner, the yatom, the orphans and the widows, so that God blesses you. And this is really what the law regarding forgetting wheat in the field is all about. Now, what does it have to do with this week's portion? Well, I thought something interesting. If we look in the regarding Joseph, in Genesis 37, in chapter 37, verse number 15 and 16, it says, "Vayimtza'eu ish, v'hinei toeh basadeh." And a man found Joseph, and behold, he was lost in the field. The man was saying to Joseph, "What are you looking for?" And Joseph says, "I'm looking for my brothers." And Hagida nali. And he says to him those words, Hagida nali, tell me, please, Ephraim, where are they herding the sheep? Well, we all know what he says, and he goes, they traveled away from this, and they went to Dotaina, where eventually they throw Joseph into the pit, and they sold him down to Egypt. There's something very, very deep over here, and I want to pay attention to it. Number one, Joseph is likened to this lost wheat stack, a stack of wheat that's been tied up, one of those omarim in the field here. And he's asking to find his brothers, and his brothers went away from this. So I feel, for some reason, like this is coming to mind, this chidush, this insight that there's a connection here of Joseph being this lost stack of wheat in the field. And even more so, is something very, very interesting. It says, Hagida nali. Please tell me that the words Hagida nali remind us last week's portion. It's fascinating. Our rabbis teach us, they bring down in a few midrashim, that everything that took place, it says these are the generations of Jacob, Joseph. So we know that there's a correlation between Joseph and Jacob. They're very similar. And the experiences that Jacob went through, Joseph went through the same experiences. It talks about the difficult births of their mothers. Rachel had Jacob and Esau and as twins in there, and the struggle there. And of course we know Rachel giving birth to Benjamin has a difficult birth, and at the end, unfortunately, dies in childbirth. And it mentions many other things. Both had to leave Israel and go out to exile. And they were both hated by their brothers. And it's fascinating to see. We're not going to go through all the details there. But the Midrash shows how similar they are. Now, last week's portion, and I want to quickly remind us what happened. Now, pay attention to the words here in 37 verse 16, talking about Joseph asking this man, this is our rabbis teach us it was an angel, telling us, where are my brothers? And he's saying, please tell me where are they herding the sheep? And the words in Hebrew, Hagida nali. Now I want to quickly go back to the last week's portion in chapter 32. We read about the dream of Jacob when he wrestled with the angel. It says, "Vayivater Yaakov levado," and Jacob remained alone. Vayavek ishimo ad alot hashachar. Right, and he was wrestling and struggling until the morning. Ishimo, this was an angel as well. He was wrestling with. Now, if we look again, and going back to this verse, Vayimtzeu ish, he finds a man, and a man finds Joseph. He's in the field, right? Vayimtzeu ish, that man, that same language, ish, is the same word mentioned in last week's portion, Vayavek ishimo. A man is struggling with him. They both refer to angels, which is really fascinating. Again, a similarity between Jacob and Joseph. But if we look here, it says, Vayal kilo yacholo, and he saw he could not win him in the wrestling match, and he strikes the thigh of Jacob. And it says, Vateka kaf yerech Yaakov be'avko imo, and it sort of went out of place, his thigh. There are different opinions. Most opinions define it as the sciatic nerve that jumped out of place, and he was injured in his sciatica. And then we're going to skip to the verse number. I'll go first. Before we skip to that verse, we'll skip to another verse. Jacob says, listen to this verse, it's fascinating. In verse number 30 in chapter 32, it says, Vayishal Yaakov, and Jacob asks, Vayom hagidana shmecha. Please tell me your name. It's fascinating. Hagidana shmecha sounds the same exact, again, as the parallel verse, which I read a minute ago, in the portion of Joseph. Vayom et achai anochi vakesh hagidana li. Tell me, where are they hurting the sheep? And the same exact language, the same exact letters are used. Hagidana shmecha. Tell me your name. When Jacob is asking the name of the angel, so he's saying, "Tell me your name." Fascinating. Same exact words. Not only that, hagidana. We're going to see something even stronger. And now we're going to skip to verse number 33 in that chapter 32. It says, Al kein lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael et gid hanasheh. Therefore, Israel will not eat gid hanasheh. Hagidana li, right? Tell me, gid hanasheh. Therefore, Israel does not eat that sinew, the gid of the nasheh, of the sciatica, because of what happened into Jacob's thigh, to this very day. So we see something that the same letters, gid hanasheh, mentioned here, that mentioned there, is also similar to in the word in Hebrew. Hagid means to give. Now, what we see these connections of Jacob and Joseph. But if we look even deeper, our rabbis say, what happened? What brought about this whole thing that Jacob ended up wrestling with the angel? Well, one explanation is Vayivater Yaakov levado. Jacob remained alone. Why did he remain alone for? And the rabbis comment and they say his children should have gone back and escorted Jacob. They should have left him alone. They should have been with Jacob. But he was left alone. And that same thing, Joseph was left alone looking for his brothers again. He was alone. Fascinating connection. And then it says that resulted in the angel wrestling with him because he was alone now. He was in danger. And that led to that wrestling match. Not only that, levado in Hebrew, it sounds very similar, likado. That's why the commentators, one of the Balei Tosafot, the commentators explain, what does it mean, Jacob, when he remained alone? He went back to retrieve, he forgot something he left in the field over there. He left something over there on the other side of the Jabbok. And what was left was likado, for his little kad, rabbis say a little jug. And some explain it as being a jug of oil, connecting us to Hanukkah. So Jacob that used that oil to anoint the rock when he came out and he was on the way to Mesopotamia, he went and he made a little monument, right, where he had the experience of the dream with the ladder, and he anointed the rock. So he had some oil. Later that oil becomes Hanukkah, which is fascinating. Now, the oil here, when he remained behind to retrieve that jug of oil, so Jacob is going back, and then he has a struggle. Now that thing, the whole thing that brought about was forgetting something. When you're forgetting something, that's causing you to have to go back to retrieve it. That led to the result of Jacob having this whole wrestling match, etc. Now, this brings us back to what I said a moment ago. about Joseph. Joseph, he was again trying to sent by his father to bring peace between the brothers, but again he was lost in the field. He got lost. He was forgotten alone. He was left alone there, and again, that's when the danger reached out to Joseph. What's fascinating here is the word in Hebrew, hanasheh. What does gid hanasheh mean? So the basic understanding of a nasheh in Hebrew could mean it jumped out of place, to jump. And so Rashi explains it, that it jumped out of its place. In other words, when something is not in its proper place, it is called, it jumped out of place, right? So it's not in its proper place. That connects to the word to forget. When something is not where it usually is, you forget it. You look, because it's lost, right? It's sort of lost from its place. And that's why in Hebrew, nosheh, when a person comes to collect a debt, he's known as a nosheh. He's collecting his debt. Why? Because he's trying to claim property of his that's been lost. He wants to reclaim his property. So it's, or his loan that he lent. So it's called a nosheh in Hebrew. It's all connected to that same word of gid hanasheh. And which is also very interesting that in Hebrew, the name for women is nashim in plural. In a plural form, a woman's name is nashim. Meaning that same why a woman forgot. It's not that women have forgotten, but they forget their father's home, because it says, therefore a man will leave, they'll leave their parents' home. King Azov Isha Tishta, right? A person in the beginning of Genesis talks about a man leaving his house, and a woman having to leave her home and becoming one united unit. So a woman basically is forgetting her father's house in a way. So that's why we say in Hebrew, Beit Menashe is a way of expressing the father-in-law's home. It's like forgotten in a way when the woman comes and joins a new area. So we see it's something very, very deep, hinted within the words here itself. The word Nasheh means to forget. Now later on, Joseph has a son. What does he name his son? Menashe. Menashe, why is he named his son Menashe? Because Joseph says something very, very profound over there. He says that God has now I forgot all my troubles and his father's house, which is so strange. How could Joseph come along and say that he's forgetting his troubles is one thing, but forgetting his father's house, that's a very difficult thing to say. But of course we can understand on a simple level, a simplistic understanding, he forgot his the difficult suffering he went through in his father's house with his brothers and all that. That's obviously the simple meaning. But in reality, we have to say it's very, very difficult, because Joseph always had in mind to return. He's saying, I was stolen from Israel, I want to go back to Israel. So that's why we have to explain it. For sure that it's referring maybe to just forgetting his trouble, but not really forgetting his household. But the other hand, you can understand it. Now he's a second in hand to the king. We're going to read about the next week's portion. And therefore, he's beginning to get settled into his new life, and little by little forgetting all the difficulties and sort of almost turning his back, God forbid. But we know Joseph doesn't do that. But it seems like it was like some kind of something that he had to overcome, and not turn his back on his parents' home and who he comes from. But it was a struggle. It wasn't so simple when you're now joining a new life and you're second in command. But it's fascinating. That's why Joseph was so special and righteous, that he remained that loyalty, although he had an easy way to just to begin a new life for himself. And it's also fascinating that he's called the Mishneh LaMelech, the second to the king. In Hebrew, Mishneh is the same letters as Menashe, to forget, right? The same letters. But it's also the same letters as Neshama, soul. And his soul always remembers where its source, where it comes from. And that's the struggle. It's the same struggle that we see with Jacob and the angel. There's something there that's trying to cause forgetfulness, to forget who we are. And Joseph right away rectifies this. And I read this in one commentary, which was fascinating, who says that the next son he names is Ephraim. And Ephraim, he says, because God has blessed me, be'eretz oni, in the land of my poverty. So here Joseph was testifying, right away rectifying that with the twin Ephraim, who came out second. Wait a second, I can't leave my father's house. I can't forget them. I have to remember who I am. And I am, of course, in a land that is a land that's ani. This is the land of my poverty. In other words, I'm not in my home. I'm away from Israel. I have to go back to Israel. Not really forgetting, although he had that opportunity, but overcoming that struggle. And I see that similar struggle that Jacob had. Again, there's similar struggles here of going at that force that tries to pull you away, or you want to overcome that force. And it's very fascinating to combine those two things. Now, if we look all this, the Midrash talks about another fascinating thing. And it says, just as we see the similarities between Jacob and Joseph, we see the similarities between Joseph and Zion. And regarding Zion, it talks about those, it says in Psalm, famous Psalm, Shir HaMalot, the Song of Ascents, it says we were like dreaming. When Hayinu Kechomim, we were like dreaming, we're thinking about the return of Zion. We were all dreaming. Why are we all dreaming? Reminds of Joseph, right? Joseph the dreamer, the great dreamer. And then it says, Bo Yavo, it says at the end, we will return to Zion, everyone carrying the sheaves, everyone carrying that wheat, that same wheat, reminding us of Joseph, of the different, when he had that dream of everyone bowing down to him. His sheaf was in the center, and they were all surrounding us and bowing down to his wheat stalk. So we see here that connection again of Zion, that return to Zion. This whole psalm referring about the return of Israel back to Zion. And that, my friends, brings us right into the story of Chanukah. Here in Chanukah, the story of our struggle against the Greeks, those who wanted to darken the light of the Torah. They wanted to take us away from the beauty of our land, of following our tradition. For them, the Greek wisdom was all about wisdom. We spoke about this a couple of years ago when I gave a class on Chanukah on that. Is that the Greeks, they admired wisdom, but they didn't understand what Torah really is. How living a life of connection to God, it's not wisdom, it's much more than wisdom. It is applying it, it is rectifying your character. It is a divine conversation between God and man. That's what the Torah is all about. It's a dialogue. A dialogue involves two sides. It is our connection to the everlasting creator of the universe. And this power of Torah, the Greeks wanted to pull away, take Israel away, separate Israel from the Torah. Oh, the Torah we can put on a library. Let's translate in 70 different, they translate, it's called a Septuagint, right? 70 translators translate into Greek, which was a tragedy, because they look at the Torah as just another wisdom in a library book, but not realizing it's a living Torah. And this concept of Chanukah is not for us to forget where we came from. That is exactly brings us back to Jacob with the Gidan Asher, and with Joseph, that lost sheaf in the field, not forgetting who we are and where we came from. That message is all about the message of Chanukah. Always remember, not letting the Hellenists come along and bring a new culture to the world and darken the Torah and bring their terrible culture which defiles the world and defiles Israel. And we have to overcome. So it's a cultural battle. The culture of the Torah, the light of the Torah, which has to overcome the darkness of that Greek darkness of Greece. This concept comes to life in Chanukah, where we find, literally, that jug that Jacob forgot, he's not going to forget that jug of oil. He went back to retrieve that jug of oil. And that same jug, he lighted the candles, Joseph, who was not going to be lost. Joseph was going to come back home. It is not one of those forgotten sheaves that we forget in the field and give it over to someone else to become part. When something is lost and the owner of that thing is lost, it enters a new home. It becomes to those who pour or collect the grains. It becomes theirs. It's another world. Here, no, Joseph is a sheaf that we don't forget. And that the law of forgetfulness doesn't apply to. We're going to bring it back home. Joseph knows that he has no place outside the land of Israel. He has to come home. He has to come back to his culture. That is why it is Joseph who lives, just like Jacob says, I spent so many years in the house of Laban, and I was not influenced by his culture. He knew how to overcome that and not fall into that new culture of Laban's culture of evilness. The same way Joseph knew how to become second in command in Egypt, and how great he was. And it was a difficult challenge, but he overcame that challenge to return to his home. As he says, Gunov gunavti me'eretz, I was stolen from the Hebrews, remembering who he was then when he was in prison, and later on, and reflecting on his children that are born, we have the opportunity to totally forget. He's remembering the story of Hanukkah. He's remembering that oil. Jacob went back to retrieve that oil. I'm not going to forget my past and who I come from. And it is that Joseph we're going to read about in the coming weeks, who's there for his family, and who's there to return to his family, to bring them life sustenance in a difficult time of famine in the world and starvation in the world. is Joseph, becomes Messiah of Joseph, that builds, that is his whole spark of bringing back the exiles, of what Mother Rachel was all about, as she cried out on the way for her children that are lost, and she says, Shavu banim levulam, and the children have returned to their borders. This is all about bringing us back to the border. Some of our children are so far gone, so lost in assimilation. But Mother Rachel is praying, and she's passing over that blessing, of course, to Joseph, who's involved. It means to gather in Hebrew, gathering up all our exiles and saying, we're not giving up, we're not forgetting on you. Gidan Hashem, right? We are not going to forget you. And Hashem meaning, again, as I said before, to forget. We are not going to forget. We're going to remember every one of our lost tribes, our lost children, as Rachel does, as Joseph gathers them all, and we will not forget everyone. We bring them back. And that's the light of Hanukkah. We will light those candles, and every candle is a reminder to send that light all over the world to bring back our lost brothers and sisters to come home again, and the light of God will shine forever. Shabbat Shalom, Besarot Tovot, Yeshuot V'Nechamot.